Hello, this is Kenneth Wong, Senior Editor for DE and the regular webcast moderator for DE's webcast series. In a recent webcast sponsored by Empire Group, we explore the pros and cons of owning your own 3D printing hardware versus outsourcing to an on-demand printing service bureau. Here is James Grimm from Empire Group.
And that's one of the things that we see as like a major barrier to adoption when companies are just trying to get started with 3D printing is that landscape is just so wild, right? And then you start getting some quotes from maybe some 3D printing manufacturers, like, oh, this stuff isn't cheap. Well, if I'm going to make that investment, is it going to be obsoleted in 2 years? Is the cost of the printer the actual cost of my overall cost? Do I have to build a building around it? Is this printer print one material? Does it print multiple materials? So there's just so many things that kind of start building up when you're looking at investing in 3D printing. And we get to this, you get to this crossroads of, does it make sense to bring a 3D printer in-house, or should I engage with a company like Empire and outsource my 3D printing needs? And there's just so many different things to really take into consideration. And I mentioned this at the beginning, that we actually see our heaviest users of services are also companies that own 3D printers themselves. So I think the solution tends to be a bit of both in the end for most people, but you usually get into it based on a lot of these different considerations. So things like the design of your part, how are you going to production, what materials are you using for production? Is it a high volume application? Is it a low volume application? What's the finish of your part? Does that match with what 3D printing can produce? And then what's your overall budget? And then we have this thing called the intangibles, which I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation.
The live poll conducted during the webcast shows nearly one-third, that is 27.8% of the live audience, both owns a 3D printer and also outsource print jobs, suggesting a hybrid approach is fairly common. More from James on things to consider when you're making the decision to buy hardware or pay for your print job.
And so when we talk about design, how's your part being designed? Are you designing for additive, so to speak? And what does that even mean, right? We actually have a couple terms at Empire that we have design for additive manufacturing, and we also have engineering for additive manufacturing, right? And the distinction I would make here is design for additive manufacturing is starting from the very beginning with additive in your mind. Engineering for additive is you've probably got a product, maybe you're trying to modify it, and you've now identified a little bit further down the road that additive manufacturing is the right way to produce your part, and so we might need to make a few little tweaks to make it 3D printable, so to speak. So design is a huge consideration. So when you're bringing a product to market and you want to use additive, or you think additive might be a possibility, and you're trying to figure out, should I buy a machine or should I use a service provider? I think this is one of those things that really has to come into play in that decision is the design of your part. The other thing that you really want to dig into a little bit is the actual production, right? So this is a lot of different things, right? So how quickly can you ramp up? So when you're producing a part with injection molding, typically you have a pretty lengthy time of the tool design and the actual manufacturing of a tool, where 3D printing is very quick. There's pros and cons to the volume question, right? How many parts are you going to be producing on an annual basis, right? So that comes into play. And then you get into a few of the other things about your actual business, right? So do you have the use case beyond the single part that you're considering for production? Is it going to be used in other ways? Is this machine going to sit idle, or is it going to be used all the time? Do you have the resources in-house? And this is actually one of those sort of hidden things here with 3D printing. The resources being, the facility resources, the space, electricity, maybe even powder control or hazardous material control, and then also the manpower required for it. So some of these processes are actually pretty labor intensive and need some hands-on folks, right? It's not as automated as some of the mainstream media might make you think. So a process like 3D printed metals, for example, has an extremely high post-processing factor. So I think you should expect to spend an equal amount on your 3D printer as you would on post-processing equipment such as a CNC mill.
Another speaker, Dustin Kloempken from HP, compares CNC to 3D printing as a means of mass production.
Now, if we look at it from a time perspective, what I have here is just an example where I picked 3 different parts, and we have, let's say you need to make 75 of one part, 30 of another design, and 50 of another design. Well, how would you go about making that if you were going to do CNC? Let's say you had one CNC to do this. Well, you kind of have to go in a stepwise linear fashion to do that. First, you make that first design, and then you might have to switch over tooling, do some programming, and then do the next one, and then do the following one. And then it's ready for the next part that you're going to produce. The great thing with specifically multi-jet fusion printing is you can do all of them at the same time as long as you can fit them all in the print bucket. So what's really nice about this is it can really compress the amount of time that is required to actually make those parts. And what you'll notice is about halfway through, below the blue there, is it says machine is ready for the next job. So pay attention to that because I'm going to explain a little bit why that is. So you can see over here in CNC there's a little bit of overlap, and I'm going to explain why that is also. But you can see in general the time is quite a bit less.
For more information, go to Empire Group's homepage, that is empiregroupusa.com. You can also find the full unedited webcast on our homepage by going to Digital Engineering 24/7, that's digitalengineering247.com, and browsing the webcast tab. Thanks for watching. I'm Kenneth Wong for DE.